Hey everybody, and welcome to Storms on the Way. I'm Alistair Stevens, and in this, our 22nd session exploring American Gods, well, we're basically going to finish the book. I mean, effectively, finish the book. This is the climax. What follows hereafter is, explicitly within the frame of the text, epilogue, though we're going to talk about that a little next week, and we're going to discuss the degree to which what follows in the wake of these titanic chapters is, in fact, an epilogue, or is possibly the heart of the story itself. We'll talk about all of that next week because we have a little bit of ground to cover this week. The storm has come, the gods, old and new, are gathering for war. But the war may not be what anyone expects. You can interact with me live during the session in the YouTube chat, or you can interact at any time in the next week, month, year over on Twitter using the hashtag StormsOTW, STORMSOTW. Before we begin, we have just no time to waste. I have, I think, 20 slides to cover in this session, so that's a lot of ground that we must cross together. But before we get to all of that, we have three things that we must discuss, three incidental details that I think explored first will illuminate our discussion of the chapters to come. The first of those is, of course, Rock City. This is effectively where we spend these two chapters, in and around Rock City, or at least heading toward Rock City. And some of you may not know that Rock City is, in fact, a real place. Let me share this, not a slide, but actually the searockcity.com website. This is a real place in or near Chattanooga, Tennessee. Rock City is basically the ultimate roadside attraction. It is the most important place in America within the frame of American Gods. It is atop Lookout Mountain in Georgia, located near Ruby Falls. It is well known throughout the Southeast, throughout parts of the Midwest too, for the See Rock City slogan that is painted on the roofs of barns, the sides of barns, just everywhere. Clark Byers, who was promoting Rock City in the 40s, 50s, through the 60s, almost up to 1970, is thought to have painted over 900 barn roofs across 19 states promoting Rock City. This is a pop culture phenomenon. And that single incident, that single fact about Rock City may lead us to understand why it is the most important place in the United States, why it is ground zero for whatever the war will be between the new gods and old. It isn't just a roadside attraction. We've discussed before why it is that roadside attractions are so powerful. It is the mythic roadside attraction. It is a roadside attraction that people who have never been to Georgia have heard of. People who have never visited Chattanooga have heard of. It is mythic in that sense. Its effect is felt far further than its, geographical presence would indicate. From Rock City, too, this is perhaps another perspective on why it is so important. From Rock City, it is said that one can see 7 states, specifically from Lover's Leap, which is the little rock outcropping that you can see here in the picture. It is said that you can see 7 states from Lover's Leap. That does not seem to be true. That has at least never been verified. It requires some very good telescopic equipment and an absolutely perfect day for it even to be remotely possible, and it has never been confirmed, but that doesn't matter, because the story is that you can see 7 states from the top of Rock City, and that is perhaps much more important. So this is where we are going to spend the bulk of these 2 chapters, though of course we're going to spend a little time backstage. We're going to spend a little time traveling, I guess, away from Rock City and then back to Rock City too. That's one thing that we have to discuss in advance of the rest of the discussion. The second thing is the repeated reference that is made to the scarred mouth of Mr. World. And, spoilers if you haven't read these chapters yet, but it turns out that Mr. World and Loki Lysmith are one and the same. They are the same character. This is, of course, pivotal to our understanding of the con that is at the heart of the plot of American Gods. So we get a number of references to Mr. World's scarred lips, and I wanted to talk about Loki's wager, effectively, which is part of the rich mythic history of Loki as a character. This is how the story goes. Loki once made a bet with the dwarf Brock. It was agreed that the price, should Loki lose the wager, would be his head. Loki lost the bet, and in due time the dwarves came to collect the head, which had become rightfully theirs. Loki had no problem giving up his head. Fine, he said, you can take my head, but The terms of our agreement permitted no damage whatsoever to my neck. So you have to be absolutely careful that you don't harm my neck in the taking of my head. Of course, there was an ongoing discussion then about what constituted neck and head and how it was even possible to remove the head that was there, right, without harming the neck. Stop me if this sounds familiar for you Shakespeare buffs out there. But in the end, no agreement could be reached. The matter could not be settled, so Loki kept his head because the dwarves were incapable of taking it. That didn't stop them, however, from stitching shut Loki's mouth as a punishment for this clever bit of wordplay escapology. This is one of the most kind of enduring and pivotal stories told about Loki, because this is one of the times that he paid the price. And Loki's wager really serves two purposes. It serves illustratively to kind of highlight the danger of nebulous agreements and the impossibility of resolving conflicts that are rooted in this kind of semantic understanding or this kind of pedantic interpretation of what the wager actually was in the first place. But it can also be used illustratively, metaphorically, to indicate a kind of Alexandrian resolution to the puzzle of the Gordian knot. That is to say that if Loki can't be trusted by his word, then sew his mouth shut so that he can't talk anymore. That's going to be, of course, very important as we move into the climax of the story. The third thing that we must acknowledge right up front is, well, okay, we must begin, I guess, thing 3, part A, is the identity of Shadow. By the time we reach this part in the book, we are, of course, not surprised that Shadow is some kind of god. We are not surprised after our reading last week to discover that he is the son of Wednesday, the son of Odin, but his exact identity hasn't yet been pinned down. A careful analysis, though, particularly given some of the context that were offered in these chapters, reveals the truth of Shadow's identity. Shadow is Balder, the son of Odin and Frigga in Norse mythology, brother of Thor. They had other brothers too, but none quite so significant as Thor, I suppose. The etymology of the name Balder is fascinating. There are actually two interpretations of the etymology of the name Balder. I'll give the first now, and then I'm going to give the second interpretation of that name right at the end of today's session, because it is absolutely relevant to the last line of this week's reading. The most obvious gloss of Balder's name is that it simply means bold and brave. That bald, obviously, and bold, that there is a direct linguistic heritage there that carries that word all the way into modern English. So Balder simply means bold and brave. As I say, there is another interpretation that we'll get to right at the end of today's session. So that's thing 3, part A. Thing 3, part B is Loki's reference to mistletoe. And this is a really great story that might actually cast a certain illumination on our understanding of Shadow's character through the course of this story. And this is very much the point, I think, where a lot of first-time readers of American Gods might get a little frustrated, might get a little, feel a little thwarted, feel a little manipulated, or might, in celebratory and with joy in their, with celebration rather, and with joy in their hearts, want to begin the book again, want to go back right the way to the beginning and look at the interactions between Shadow and Loki, for example, or Shadow and Wednesday right from the jump, and reinterpret that relationship. It is rare, I think, for one of these seminar series to end with an injunction to go and reread the book, but I'm kind of feeling that urge myself now. I must admit, I'm kind of feeling like I want to go all the way back to the beginning to pick up all of these little incidental details, because, of course, I've read American Gods before, but I've never read it this carefully. So even on a careful reading, new elements are revealed. There's new opportunities for speculation as you move through the book. So a rereading, I think, is absolutely in order, and there may be, I think, maybe a special episode of Storms on the Way a couple of months from now, possibly even after I wrap up season 3 of Dear Mr. Potter, in which I'm going to discuss Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. There may be a special episode of Storms on the Way in which I go back to American Gods and highlight some of the very careful and very referential foreshadowing that really fills the first third of the book. It would be really interesting to go and take a look at that. But specifically, I want to talk about the mistletoe, because one of the great things about the myth of Balder is his invulnerability. He basically cannot be killed. And this is because there is a prophetic foreshadowing of Balder's death early in his life. And Odin travels into the underworld and discovers that in fact this is going to pass. The seer of the underworld tells him, no, Balder is going to die. We're ready for him. We have a banquet all set up to welcome him into the underworld because his death is absolutely solid. That is a lock. That is definitely going to happen. So Frigga and Odin go out into the world and they secure from everything, from all of the men and beasts and elements of the world, from the rocks and the sky and the sea themselves, they secure oaths that they will never harm Balder. These oaths are given freely, so they return and hang out with Balder, who delights in his new invulnerability. Nothing can kill him. People are throwing rocks at him, people are casting spears at him, people are hitting him with swords. Nothing can harm him, except there is, of course, a loophole. Because no oath was gained from mistletoe, this humble little parasitic plant. No oath was taken from mistletoe because mistletoe can't harm anyone. That's impossible. Of course, Loki takes this as an opportunity and tricks one of the great warriors of Asgard into casting a mistletoe spear, or in some cases, stop me if this sounds familiar too, just a mistletoe stick at Balder, which of course kills him outright. So mistletoe is his Achilles' heel, if I can, mash those mythological systems together. That is why the reference to mistletoe is so important in the second chapter that we're going to study today. That, I think, gives us a platform. That gives us a foundation. That gives us a framework that allows us to move with purpose into this week's reading. Let me check here on the YouTube chat. Sarah says, this was my first time reading American Gods, and I will definitely be rereading it. But I have a mountain of other books I need to get to first. That, I think, is the best way to do it. I don't necessarily think that one should launch into American Gods again directly, because so much of the pleasure of this book is rediscovering the prose, is simply rediscovering Gaiman's utter, profound mastery over the written word. And I think that allowing it to lay fallow, remembering the key points of the plot and the key reveals that we get, particularly in this week's reading, and then going back and reading it fresh, you really get the best of both worlds. Once you've allowed the prose itself to recede in the mind and the memory a little, I think you get that pleasure, that enjoyment, but you also get this much more analytical, much more nerdy pleasure of putting together the pieces and of getting all of the foreshadowing that Gaiman seeds through the books. Aaron says, mistletoe, good for kissing, good for killing. I think there's pretty much a good equivocation between those two things. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Yes, Nicole says, well, mistletoe won't hurt anyone unless you try to eat it. That's true. I suppose there could be another version of the myth where Loki tricks the greatest chef of Asgard into baking some kind of mistletoe pie, something like that. That would also presumably have the same effect on Balder. Who can say? Who can say for sure? But of course, it is important to talk about Balder's death, the inevitability of his death, the necessity of his death, because of course, I didn't mention this, but perhaps I should, for those of you who are not not scholars of Norse mythology in the audience. Balder's death is important because it is the harbinger of Ragnarok. Balder's death is vital because it marks basically the beginning of the apocalypse. This is part of the prophecy that is woven around Balder in his early years. Yeah. Okay. Becca says, now all I want is poison lipstick to be laced with mistletoe. I like that. That's pretty good too. Okay, let's get into our reading then, because as I say, we have just an enormous amount of ground to cover and not much time to do it. Let's get underway with the first slide from the first chapter here. The most important place in the southeastern United States is advertised on hundreds of aging barn roofs across Georgia and Tennessee and up into Kentucky. On a winding road through a forest, a driver will pass a rotting red barn and see, painted on its roof, "See Rock City, the 8th wonder of the world." And on the roof of a tumble-down milking shed nearby, painted in white block letters, "See 7 states from Rock City, the world's wonder." The driver is led by this to believe that Rock City is surely just around the nearest corner, instead of being a day's drive away on Lookout Mountain, a hair over the state line in Georgia, just southwest of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Lookout Mountain is not much of a mountain. It resembles an impossibly high and commanding hill, brown from a distance, green with trees and houses from up close. The Chickamauga, a branch of the Cherokee, lived there when the white man came. They called the mountain, I'm going to stumble over this, Chattanooga, which has been translated as the mountain that rises to a point. In the 1830s, Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act forced them all from their land, all the Choctaw and Chickamauga and Cherokee and Chickasaw, and U.S. troops forced every one of them that they could find and catch to walk over 1,000 miles to the new Indian territories in what would one day be Oklahoma. down the Trail of Tears, a cheerful gesture of casual genocide. Thousands of men, women, and children died on the way. When you've won, and nobody can argue with that. For whoever controlled Lookout Mountain controlled the land. That was the legend. It was a sacred site, after all, and it was a high place. In the Civil War, the war between the states, there was a battle there, the battle above the clouds. That was the first day's fighting. And then the Union forces did the impossible, and without orders, swept up Missionary Ridge and took it. The troops of General Grant won the day, and the North took Lookout Mountain, and the North took the war. There are tunnels and caves, some very old, beneath Lookout Mountain. For the most part, they're blocked off now, although a local businessman excavated an underground waterfall, which he called Ruby Falls. It can be reached by elevator. It's a tourist attraction, although the biggest tourist attraction of all is at the top of Lookout Mountain. That is Rock City. One of the things that we get here, one of the things that is made absolutely explicit, is the connection between Lookout Mountain, between Rock City, and the land. This is of vital importance, and certainly one of the perspectives that we get on the importance of Rock City, the importance of Lookout Mountain, is that it is a confluence between the two sides of America, the two visions of America, the land and the story, the native culture that reveres this as a sacred place, and the interloper culture, which has established tourist attractions on and around the mountain. Of course, the connection with the Trail of Tears is powerful and profound and troubling, particularly when we get into chapter 18 and we really start discussing the significance of the land in terms of America. We'll get to all of that in due course, but we must remember always that Lookout Mountain is a sacred place as well as being a tourist attraction. It speaks to both elements of American mythology here. Let's spend some time here studying the narrative voice, because we've discussed this last week. We've discussed this at several points through the span of Storms on the Way. Who is telling this story? Who is offering this perspective, this quasi-judgmental perspective? A cheerful gesture of casual suicide. Thousands of men, women, and children died on the way. When you've won, and nobody can argue with that. What does that mean? Who is telling this story, and what does that perspective tell us about the significance of Rock City, the eighth wonder of the world? We begin with this fanciful, whimsical little digression. The most important place in the southeastern United States is advertised on hundreds of aging barn roofs across Georgia and Tennessee and up into Kentucky. On a winding road through a forest, a driver will pass a rotting red barn. We're not looking at this in the abstract. This is not an excerpt from Wikipedia. This is something far more personal. We're summoning forth the idea of this driver, this archetypal driver, of this archetypal barn, this archetypal milking shed. This is part of the Rock City experience. Seeing these billboards, seeing these, I guess not billboards technically, but these improvised billboards, if you like, seeing these signs for Rock City is part of the mythology of Rock City. It is kind of mythologically diasporic in that sense. It itself has sent out spores into the world, and they have bloomed into these barn roofs and the sides of milking sheds all across these states, all across 19 states, as I said earlier. So we get, first of all, a personal account of an interaction with that. Not a directly personal account, but a kind of theoretical, hypothetical, archetypal personal account of our interaction with Rock City from someone who presumably is never going to go there, from someone who is never going to allow the reality of Lookout Mountain to supersede the myth of the tourist attraction. And I guess that is one of the ways that we can begin to draw a distinction here. Because I've been using up until this point Lookout Mountain and Rock City pretty much interchangeably, but I think it is fair to say that that is the dividing line, that Lookout Mountain is of the land and Rock City is of the myth, America, the roadside attraction, whatever that component is, whatever that component represents. So our narrator here begins by conflating the two, because we see the Rock City billboards, and then we get the description of Lookout Mountain. We get the description of the Native American cultures that existed around that place prior to the Trail of Tears, prior to this, forcible relocation, the Indian Removal Act of the 1830s. That draws a very specific connection, almost a parallel between the artifice of Rock City and the natural significance of Lookout Mountain itself. But then we come all the way down to Rock City. We arrive at that last. So who is telling this story? Well, we have a couple of suggestions here. Becca says, I want this to be Ibis dictating as Whiskey Jack tells the story. That's actually rather good. I like that quite a lot. I'm not sure that it feels urgent enough, strident enough, critical enough for it to be Whiskey Jack. It does feel to me, once again, like Ibis. It feels as though Ibis's narration, as we discussed last time, is growing beneath the actual narrative voice of the novel. It's kind of leaching through this permeable membrane of text. It's becoming the narrative voice. Mr. Ibis, his authorial voice is kind of conflicting with and almost superseding what we have thought of up until fairly recently as the narrative voice of American Gods, the novel. This is going to get even worse as we begin the next chapter. Even worse, even better. I mean, it's brilliant prose, but it is going to become even more pointed and severe as we begin the next chapter. We'll get to that. But for me, this represents a loss of cohesion. Now that the storm is here, now that the war is beginning, the dividing lines between the realms of mortals and the realm of mortals and the realm of gods is blurring. We get an odd and a kind of imbalanced perspective on that when we get the story of Mr. Town going to the tree to recover the stick from Mr. World. That's very strange because we're simultaneously anchoring these events in the real world, but also backstage. But there is seemingly a fluidity between the two now. We're going to continue to track that as we move into next week's supposed epilogue. We'll see how that works out. Good. Skipa says, random tourism note, an ex-beau of mine from Georgia grew up knowing people who vandalize signs for Ruby Falls as Ruby Balls as a rite of passage. Just a bit of local flavor. Good. That's very excellent. Nicole said, some friends and I took a trip to Maine and went to see the world's only life-size chocolate mousse after we had all been reading American Gods. We were all very amused to think it could be a powerful place. Oh, almost certainly. Can you imagine? What would Americans love more than a chocolate mousse? That seems like perhaps the most American roadside attraction. We're going to talk a little about the American relationship with food. This has been a subject which has fallen a little fallow here in our discussion of American Gods. It was very important right at the beginning of the book. The discussion of food and the significance of food kind of comes full circle as we meet Whiskey Jack again at the beginning of the next chapter. All of that, though, is in our future. Let's move on to Lookout Mountain, where we learn they are coming. They came to Lookout Mountain from all across the United States. They were not tourists. They came by car and they came by plane and by bus and by railroad and on foot. Some of them flew. They flew low and they flew only in the dark of night, but still, they flew. Several of them traveled their own ways beneath the earth. Many of them hitchhiked, catching rides from nervous motorists or from truck drivers. Those who had cars or trucks would see the ones who had not, walking beside the roads or at rest stations and in diners on the way, and recognizing them for what they were, would offer them rides. They arrived dust-stained and weary at the foot of Lookout Mountain. Looking up to the heights of the tree-covered slope, they could see, or imagine they could see, the paths and gardens and streams of Rock City. They started arriving early in the morning. The second wave of them arrived at dusk, and for several days they simply kept coming. This is the arrival of the old gods. We know that this is the arrival of the old gods because of the catalog of gods that we get. I couldn't quote the entire thing, and I couldn't take the hour that would be necessary to break down each specific god that is mentioned or each group of gods that is mentioned, but it is a fascinating exercise, let me tell you. So the old gods are coming, and they are coming by car and by plane and by bus and by railroad and on foot. Some of them fly, some of them travel beneath the earth. They are all, though, coming to this place. We have passed the point at which being a god in America in the 21st century means living quietly, living on the periphery. Now we are gathering en masse. Now we are gathering in force for whatever comes next. We'll take another look at this from another perspective in a couple of slides' time when we get to the new gods coming to Lookout Mountain. But first, we must segue away to Laura, because part of what makes these two chapters together so interesting is the way that the pacing picks up. The pacing is accelerated here because we get simply shorter scenes. The shorter and more frequent your narrative beats, the quicker the pace of your story. That is basically what controls pacing. That doesn't mean that long scenes are always slow and short scenes are always fast, but that generally holds true. Shorter scenes means faster beats. Shorter sentences means that your reader reads faster, moves more swiftly through the prose of your book. And it is clear at this point that Gaiman is purposefully amping up the pacing of the novel. We'll look at that as we move through some of these slides. We'll pick out incidental pieces of prose that illustrate that point, I think, rather convincingly. Let's get, though, to Laura. Laura was thirsty. Sometimes living people burned steadily in her mind like candles, and sometimes they flamed like torches. It made them easy to avoid, and it made them easy, on occasion, to find. Shadow had burned so strangely with his own light up on that tree. She had chided him once on that day when they had walked and held hands for not being alive. She had hoped, perhaps, to see a spark of raw emotion, something that would show her that the man she had once been married to was a real man, a live one. She had seen nothing at all. She remembered walking beside him, wishing that he could understand what she was trying to say. Now, dying on the tree, Shadow was utterly alive. She had watched him as the life had faded, and he had been focused and real. And he had asked her to stay with him, to stay the whole night. He had forgiven her. Perhaps he had forgiven her. It did not matter. He had changed. That was all she knew. The nature of Shadow's transformation on the tree is, again, something that we will pick up as we move into the next chapter. But this perspective from Laura is invaluable. And I would draw your attention to the way that we use the metaphor of fire, the way that we use the metaphor of light. Sometimes living people burned steadily in her mind like candles. Sometimes they flamed like torches. And then we move into the next paragraph. She had hoped perhaps to see a spark of raw emotion, something there to indicate that flickering of life. But in that second paragraph, she directly equates being alive with raw emotion. If it is a spark of raw emotion that she is looking for, that may be what indicates life. We talked a little last time about what it was that Shadow was pursuing. Ironically, of course, it seems as though Laura does not understand Shadow's understanding. She says she remembered walking beside him, wishing that he could understand what she was trying to say, though we know from our privileged perspective that Shadow, in fact, seemed to understand exactly what she was saying. Not at the time, perhaps, or at least not entirely at the time, but ultimately he has come to an understanding. That's pretty powerful. So now he is blazing in the tree. Even as he dies, he is alive. So what are the elements of life from Laura's perspective, and presumably from Shadow's too, because we know that he too feels alive in the branches of Yggdrasil. So we have the spark of raw emotion, and then in the last paragraph there, she had watched him as the life had faded, and he had been focused and real. So there is an element of connection, a presence, an identity, a focus that speaks to aliveness as a quality, and also a kind of primacy, an emotional primacy within the frame of your own experience. That seems to be what Laura is pointing to, and clearly it is important to her. Here she notes them. Sometimes living people burned steadily in her mind like candles. Sometimes they flamed like torches. And I think that if we understand emotional primacy, emotional urgency to be one of the factors that contribute to a person's light, a person's fire in that sense, we can maybe understand the difference between candles and torches, that some give a steady, warming glow and some give a fiercer and more erratic fire. That seems awfully significant. So this is Laura's experience walking away from Shadow. He had forgiven her. Perhaps he had forgiven her. It did not matter. He had changed. That was all she knew. And I do think that we can parse a subtlety there for Laura. He had forgiven her. Perhaps he had forgiven her. It did not matter. He had changed. That was all she knew. So it doesn't matter if whatever Shadow was had forgiven her, because that Shadow is dead now. And maybe that Shadow is all the Shadow that there was and he is dead, or maybe in the changing something new will emerge in some sense, perhaps not in the sense of, walking through the world, not even as Laura does, but Shadow's transformation means that the forgiveness is inessential or unnecessary at this point. Or, if you take a more cynical view, impossible, that she simply cannot achieve it. She cannot be rewarded by that. But Laura's story is not over. Not yet. The water was colder than she had ever imagined liquid water could be. It froze her tongue and her teeth and her gullet. Still, she drank, unable to stop drinking, feeling the water freezing its way into her stomach, her bowels, her heart, her veins. The water flowed into her. It was like drinking liquid ice. She realized that the jug was empty, and surprised, she put it down on the table. The women were observing her dispassionately. Since her death, Laura had not thought in metaphors. Things were or they were not. But now, as she looked at the women on the sofa, she found herself thinking of juries, of scientists observing a laboratory animal. She shook, suddenly and convulsively. She reached out a hand to the table to steady herself, but the table was slipping and lurching, and it almost avoided her grasp. As she put her hand on the table, she began to vomit. She brought up bile and formalin, centipedes and maggots, and then she could feel herself start to void and to piss. Stuff was being pushed violently, wetly from her body. She would have screamed if she could, but then the dusty floorboards came up to meet her so fast and so hard that had she been breathing, they would have knocked the breath from her body. Time rushed over her and into her, swirling like a dust devil. 1,000 memories began to play at once. She was wet and stinking on the floor of the farmhouse. She was lost in a department store the week before Christmas, and her father was nowhere to be seen. And now she was sitting in the bar in Chi-Chi's, ordering a strawberry daiquiri and checking out her blind date, the big, grave man-child, and wondering how he kissed. And she was in the car as sickeningly it rolled and jolted, and Robbie was screaming at her until the metal post finally stopped the car, but not its contents from moving. The water of time, which comes from the spring of fate, Urd's well, is not the water of life. Not quite. It feeds the roots of the world tree, though, and there is no other water like it. When Laura woke in the empty farmhouse room, she was shivering, and her breath actually steamed in the morning air. There was a scrape on the back of her hand and a wet smear on the scrape, the red-orange of fresh blood. And she knew where she had to go. She had drunk from the water of time which comes from the spring of fate. She could see the mountain in her mind. She licked the blood from the back of her hand, marveling at the film of saliva, and she began to walk. So this is Laura's rebirth? Well, no, not rebirth. This is Laura's cessation of continuing experience, I suppose. This is Laura's reset button. Here, by imbibing from Urd's well, by imbibing the waters of time, she is granted life, in a sense. She is renewed. That's clear. The blood, the saliva, the sensation that she has, even the experience of pain, certainly later, the sensation of taste will be new to her. It is, as we will learn, impermanent, but it is no less powerful. So what is the nature here of Laura's rebirth? Why is she here, firstly? Why is she given this gift by the Norns? What happens to her? And why, crucially, does she get the vision of the mountain? Well, I think that what we see here through the drinking of the waters of time is a blurring of Laura's experience. We just talked about the immediacy of Shadow's experience, right? Part of the reason that he is not alive, not really alive, is that he himself is dislocated in time, that he himself is temporally blurred. He is coexistent in past, present, and future, and not just in the way that all human beings are, but he is specifically anchored in the past. He is anchored to his experience in prison, and he is anchored to the revelation about Laura's infidelity, and he is anchored presumably to the moment of her burial, and he is held back from the present. He is pulled out from the present by all of these experiences, and it is only when he lets these experiences go, and this, if we are inclined to believe that he did in fact forgive Laura, this is all part of that forgiveness, or I guess I should say the forgiveness is part of this greater experience. Now as he hung in the branches of Yggdrasil, he is present in the moment. Sensation and focus are his, and that makes him in some sense more alive. Now, Laura, of course, is always immediately present. Even when she is actually dead, she is alive in the sense that she is physically connected to the world around her, but not alive in the sense that she cannot experience it. She can't touch or taste it or sense it as fully as she used to be able to. The world is monochromatic for her now. So she's clinging to life, I think, in both senses, both in the generally accepted meaning of the word alive, the way that we distinguish alive things from dead things, but also in this somewhat more abstract, somewhat more nebulous concept that is attached to that word in the pages of American Gods. She is clinging to life, yes, but also clinging to aliveness. She is still more focused than Shadow. She is still more alive than Shadow. But here it seems to me that we get a kind of replication of Shadow's temporal disassociation, this temporal blurring that I just mentioned. Here, Laura is pulled out of the present and kind of blurred through her entire timeline. We get these memories. 1,000 memories began to play at once. Wet and stinking on the floor of the farmhouse, lost in the department store the week before Christmas, sitting in the bar at Chi-Chi's, in the car with Robbie. These are pivotal experiences for her, and those are only 4. She gets 1,000 simultaneously rolling through her, pulling her out of this moment and spreading her across her life. And in so doing, it seems to me that she gets a kind of life back from that. Laura here, to my interpretation and to my mind, is borrowing moments of life, fragments of life, fractions of life from all of her experience. That the Laura of all of these memories is partly diminished by the need of this Laura to be somehow re-embodied. And of course, if we are borrowing moments and memories from all of Laura's experience, we're not just borrowing them from the past, but also from the future. Why is Lookout Mountain so important to Laura? Does she have a stake in the war between the gods? Does she have a stake in Shadow's presence? A stake in her own terminal punctuation. We'll get to that in due course. Good. Oh, Tom says, I always loved Yggdrasil from Hyperion, the flying space tree ship, though much more epic than that sounds. Yes, no, that's a very good pull. Wow, I haven't thought about that in forever. That's good. Yes, good. Let's move on then. I'm keeping our slides up for just the longest time here. I'll try not to do that so much as we push on. But now that Laura has been taken care of, the old gods have come to Lookout Mountain. It is time for the new gods to show up, and we have to, of course, oppose this with that first passage that we read. They came to Rock City in long limousines and in small sports cars and in oversized SUVs. Many of them wore the sunglasses of those who habitually wear sunglasses indoors and out and do not willingly or comfortably remove them. There were suntans and suits and shades and smiles and scowls. They came in all sizes and shapes, all ages and styles. All they had in common was a look, a very specific look. It said, "You know me," or perhaps, "You ought to know me." An instant familiarity that was also a distance, a look, or an attitude, the confidence that the world existed for them, and that it welcomed them, and that they were adored. The fat kid moved among them with the shuffling walk of one who, despite having no social skills, has still become successful beyond his dreams. His black coat flapped in the wind. Something that stood beside the soft drink stand in Mother Goose Court coughed to attract his attention. It was massive, and scalpel blades jutted from its face and its fingers. Its face was cancerous. "It will be a mighty battle," it told him in a glutinous voice. "It's not going to be a battle," said the fat kid. "All we're facing here is a fucking paradigm shift. It's a shakedown. Modalities like battles are so fucking Lao Tzu." The cancerous thing blinked at him. "Waiting," is all it said in reply. "Whatever," said the fat kid. Then, "I'm looking for Mr. World. You seen him?" The thing scratched itself with a scalpel blade, a humorous lower lip pushed out in concentration. Then it nodded. "Over there," it said. The fat kid walked away without a thank you in the direction indicated. The cancerous thing waited, saying nothing, until the kid was out of sight. "It will be a battle," said the cancerous thing to a woman whose face was smudged with phosphor dots. She nodded and leaned closer to it. "So how does that make you feel?" she asked in a sympathetic voice. It blinked, and then it began to tell her. So much going on in a relatively short passage here. The arrival of the new gods in long limousines and in small sports cars and in oversized SUVs, the wearing of sunglasses, suntans and suits and shades and smiles and scowls, sizes and shapes, all ages and styles. This is a beautiful opposition with the arrival of the old gods. Yes, the old gods come in cars and trucks and by planes and by trains or on foot or they fly. But these are generic things. These are abstractions. These are ideas of American transportation. Here we get cars which are not about transportation. They are not functional first, they are form first. Long limousines, small sports cars, oversized SUVs. What do these things have in common? They are statements. They are not about the doing of the thing, they are about the appearance of the thing. They are the superficies of American celebrity culture. Many of them wore the sunglasses of those who habitually wear sunglasses. There's something gross about this. There's something slimy about this. And all they had in common was a look, a very specific look. It said, you know me, or perhaps you ought to know me. And I love the distinction there. The first is a statement of fact. The second is a moral injunction. You ought to know me. Not you should know me, you probably know me, but you ought to know me. And if you don't, then you are failing in your duty somehow. This is the best analysis that we've had so far of the conflation, certainly the comfortable coexistence of new godhood and celebrity. That these cultures are combined to the point of utter continuity. We're not just aping the trappings here of celebrity culture, particularly, quintessentially American celebrity culture. We are, in some sense, embodying those. The old gods are about function, and the new gods are, at least in part, about form. So that's the first beat in this slide. Then we get the technical boy. I don't know exactly what the massive scalpel-bladed cancerous figure is next to the soft drink stand in Mother Goose Court, but it is certainly unpleasant. Some kind of cancer would certainly be suggested by its form, some kind of surgical something. I'm almost tempted to draw a connection between it and kind of notions of cool celebrity self-harm, that there's something very unpleasant there with the scalpel bladed fingers. If you have a suggestion here in the YouTube chat, then definitely shout out. Oh, Nicole says Tom Cruise showing up for a showdown with Mr. Nancy in Chernobog. I have no doubt who is going to win that. Yes. And a few of you, of course, are pulling out your favorite parts of this prose because it is just beautifully written. It will be a mighty battle, it told him in a glutinous voice, to which the technical boy replies, no, you're misunderstanding. That is not what this is, despite the fact that there are two massed armies now at Lookout Mountain, one below, one above. All we're facing here is a fucking paradigm shift. It's a shakedown. Modalities like battle are so fucking Lao Tzu. We have moved beyond the idea of battle. We have moved beyond the idea of war. How ironic this will be later. Technical Boy is a difficult character in this chapter. He's a difficult character throughout the book, as we've discussed before, but he's particularly difficult in this chapter because we begin to understand that he is regretful of his actions, that he is at least uncomfortable about his actions, that he looks on the brutal killing of Bilquis as something regrettable, at the very least, something inelegant, something inefficient, something that ought not to have happened, that there's a better way. And this, I think, is the silver lining to the technical boy. If the technical boy has the possibility of redemption within him, it stems from this idea that things can be improved. The very mutability of technology tells us that things can be improved, that we relentlessly progress toward the better solution. We relentlessly progress toward some kind of perfectibility, to some kind of apotheotic state where we're moving toward better. That is in part what technology is about. It is defined by the obsolescence and replacement of inferior solutions. Now, that makes it, of course, fundamentally disposable. It makes it fundamentally insubstantial because what technology represents is an ever-moving target, but the technical boy is caught within his own paradigm. He is caught within his own model and means of observing and understanding the world. And that is tragic because ultimately that movement toward a better solution is going to crash into the oldest solution. And I find Technical Boy an absolutely engaging presence here. Yeah. Let me see here as we move through. Could it just be cancer, says Skipa. Cosmetic surgery, says Tom. That's actually very good. Yes, Aaron got there. Oh, and Jennifer too is leaning in there. Oh, Jennifer has a terrible thought. I think the cancer thing is healthcare or health insurance. Yeah, that's today of all days, you guys. That's a particularly troubling thought. Yes, that's good. I like all of those interpretations. Yeah, excellent, excellent. So here we get, yes, the difficulty of Technical Boy. He is looking for Mr. World. He is seeking reassurance or seeking confirmation or some kind of direct connection. We'll come back to that in just a few pages here. We move on, though. We switch focus again now out of the camp of the new gods to the camp of some of the oldest gods. This is our introduction of Masha of the Morrigans, which is a really interesting perspective here on Irish mythology. The Morrigan are 3 Irish warrior goddesses who are able to foretell the fate of battles. So they arrive at Rock City for the battle between the old gods and the new. Their arms are covered in tattoos. These are quintessentially Irish, almost not even quite mythic figures, almost folkloric figures, but also mythic figures. Again, the Venn diagram there is indistinct and fuzzy, but certainly overlapping. This is an interesting kind of evocation of another kind of mythic figure and another kind of perspective on the coming battle. A barefoot girl came out of the encampment, walking toward her. She stopped beside a tree, hitched up her skirts, and squatted. When she had finished, Easter hailed her. The girl walked over. "Good morning, lady," she said. "The battle will start soon now." The tip of her pink tongue touched her scarlet lips. She had a black crow's wing tied with leather onto her shoulder, a crow's foot on a chain around her neck. Her arms were blue tattooed with lines and patterns and intricate knots. "How do you know?" The girl grinned. "I am Macha of the Morgan. When war comes, I can smell it in the air. I am a war goddess, and I say blood shall be spilled this day." "Oh," said Easter. "Well, there you go." She was watching the smaller dot in the sky as it tumbled down toward them, dropping like a rock. "And we shall fight them, and we shall kill them, every one," said the girl. "And we shall take their heads as trophies, and the crows shall have their eyes and their corpses." The dot had become a bird, its wings outstretched, riding the gusty morning winds above them. Easter cocked her head on one side. "Is that some hidden war goddess knowledge?" she asked. "The whole who's going to win thing? Who gets whose heads?" "No," said the girl. "I can smell the battle, but that's all. But we'll win, won't we? We have to. I saw what they did to the Allfather. It's them or us." "Yeah," said Easter. "I suppose it is." Another perspective on the coming war. And Easter, too, has been changed. Easter, too, is different now. Easter, too, is... Easter has become something other. And she has become something other for very different reasons, but I think it is absolutely fair to draw the parallel between Easter here and the Technical Boy. The Technical Boy is defined by change and by mutability and by progress, and Easter is not. She has had this thrust upon her. She is an old god who has been transformed into something else, and we've had perspectives on this. We've been given accounts of old gods who have been changed or who have changed, but Easter occupies this very subtle and very treacherous position within that framework, within that paradigm, to borrow the Technical Boy's rather odious marketing speak word. Easter has been changed and has thus gained a different perspective, has thus gained a privileged perspective all her own, but she retains the truth of herself. She still retains her essence. She is connected to war, to times of hardship, to times of frost and famine. She is connected to the Morrigan. Easter, Ostara, and the Morrigan should be absolutely on the same page, but Easter has been changed by new faith, by a new association. Her story has altered, and the faith that she has received, the belief that she has received, the prayers, if we can call them prayers, the mode and manner in which her name has been spoken has changed. So here we get two compatible depictions of outliers, basically. We get the technical boy who was on the fringes of New God culture, and we get Easter who was on the fringes of Old God culture. Would Chernobog feel the same way? Would Mr. Nancy even feel the same way? Well, no, probably not. Easter is, again, an outlier whose gift is life, who is in her way antithetical to warfare and bloodshed and death, and who still and nonetheless is defined by the necessity of war and bloodshed and death, the scarcity of food. Murder has been done in Ostara's name through the ages. Wars have been fought in Ostara's name through the ages. That means that she is very similar in that sense to many of the old gods. Good. Yes. I'm scrolling back here through the YouTube chat. Aaron says, I may have briefly dated the Morrigan in college. That can happen. That can definitely happen. Good. All right. Let me see as we move on here and try and draw ever closer. This is, in fact, the last slide from chapter 17 as we move into, well, the end of the technical boy. Let me show you. It'll be just like this, said Mr. World. Watch. He took the wooden-bladed hunter's knife from the pocket of his Burberry, and in one fluid movement, he slipped the blade of it into the soft flesh beneath the fat kid's chin and pushed hard upward into the brain. I dedicate this death to Odin, he said as the knife sank in. There was a leakage onto his hand of something that was not actually blood, and a sputtering, sparking noise behind the fat kid's eyes. The smell in the air was that of burning insulation wire, as if somewhere a plug was overloading. The fat kid's hand twitched spastically, and then he fell. The expression on his face was one of puzzlement and misery. Look at him, said Mr. World conversationally to the air. He looks as if he just saw a sequence of zeros and ones turn into a cluster of brightly colored birds, and then just fly away. There was no reply from the empty rock corridor. Mr. World shouldered the body as if it weighed very little, and he opened the pixie diorama and dropped the body beside the still, covering it with his long black raincoat. He would dispose of it that evening, he decided, and he grinned his scarred grin. Hiding a body on a battlefield would be almost too easy. Nobody would ever notice. Nobody would ever care. For a little while there was silence in that place, and then a gruff voice, which was not Mr. World's, cleared its throat in the shadows and said, Good start. The death of the technical boy, and the first death dedicated to Odin, pledged to Odin. Becca says, I love that he's wearing a Burberry coat and super not sad to see that boy die. It's an interesting, an interesting pair of details crashing into each other here. Burberry has a very particular reputation. If you are from the United Kingdom, if you are in particular from Scotland, if you are in particular from the northeast of Scotland, as I am, Burberry was, for a long while, the uniform of a certain, youthful subculture, which was not necessarily a positively depicted or even inherently positive youthful subculture. And that association was almost certainly not intentional from Neil Gaiman, but it is interesting that it reads as very intentional now. Chavs, yes, as Jenny is calling out and Tom is calling out here too. Yes, I'm talking about Chav subculture. It's not great. It's not great, you guys. Jennifer says, bye-bye, technical boy. We won't miss you. Well, it's interesting that apparently no one here is feeling the pang of empathy, or at least pang of conflict that I have here for technical boy as we move through this chapter. But you're right. He is still vile to the end. But what is much more important here, this is our first suggestion that Mr. World's aim is not as simple as it may appear, that the war may not be all that it is presented as, that the dedication by Mr. World of a death to Odin, and then this mysterious voice, which, interestingly, if you listen to the audiobook version of American Gods, is not a mysterious voice at this point, but this mysterious voice clearing its throat in the shadows and saying, good start. This is the point at which we begin to see the real shape of the plot underlying the superficial shape of the plot. And Aaron is giving us the hashtag justice for Bilquis. Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 17. And basically what is past is prologue. We have now drawn our breath. We are now ready to move into the actual climax of the story. And we do so with a great deal of purpose. And this, for everything that I said about the pacing of the previous chapter and the more frequent and swift intercutting between the scenes, all of that is true for chapter 17. But as we move into chapter 18, the pace accelerates still further. Still a lot of ground to cover, you guys. Let's move into that. And we'll move into this, in fact, with one of the most striking things in the entire book, one of the most unusual narrative perspectives in the entire book. We just talked about the narrative voice at the beginning of chapter 17. We talked last time about the narrative voice at the beginning of chapter 16. We've talked frequently about the intrusion and the conflict between these narrative voices. But this is one of the first times that the book addresses the reader. This is almost almost a breaking of the fourth wall. This is almost a transgression out of the coherent and consistent secondary world that Gaiman has created. We are reminded now that we are being told a story, though that by this point should not suggest to us that this is any less important. None of this can actually be happening. If it makes you more comfortable, you can simply think of it as a metaphor. Religions are, by definition, metaphors, after all. God is a dream, a hope, a woman, an ironist, a father, a city, a house of many rooms, a watchmaker who left his prize chronometer in the desert, someone who loves you. Even, perhaps against all evidence, a celestial being whose only interest is to make sure your football team, army, business, or marriage thrives, prospers, and triumphs over all opposition. Religions are places to stand and look and act, vantage points from which to view the world. So none of this is happening. Such things could not occur in this day and age. Never a word of it is literally true, although it all happened. And the next thing that happened like this. At the foot of Lookout Mountain, which is scarcely more than a very high hill, men and women were gathered around a small bonfire in the rain. They stood beneath the trees, which provided poor cover, and they were arguing. The Lady Kali, with her ink-black skin and white sharp teeth, said, "It is time." Anansi, with lemon-yellow gloves and silvering hair, shook his head. "We can wait," he said. While we can wait, we should wait." There was a murmur of disagreement from the crowd. "No, listen, he's right," said an old man with iron-gray hair, Chernobog. He was holding a small sledgehammer, resting the head of it on his shoulder. "They have the high ground. The weather is against us. This is madness to begin this now." Something that looked a little like a wolf and a little more like a man grunted and spat on the forest floor. "When better to attack then, Dedushka? Shall we wait until the weather clears when they expect it? I say we go now. I say we move." Conflict among the old gods. But what is much more important in this passage is something that is approaching, or something that is possibly masquerading as, a thesis statement. Let's look at the beginning of this passage. None of this can actually be happening. If it makes you more comfortable, you can simply think of it as a metaphor. Religions are, by definition, metaphors. After all, God is a dream, and so forth. Religions are metaphors. God is a dream. Well, we're capitalizing God here. And we're pulling examples: a dream, a hope, a woman, an ironist, a father, a city, a house of many rooms. We're pulling monotheistic imagery here in a way that we haven't through the rest of this book. So we're drawing a direct connection between religion, which we don't usually talk about in terms of American gods. We talk about faith, and we talk about belief, and we talk about prayer, but we don't really talk about religion. And we're addressing what seems to be a monotheistic God. Both of those things kind of stress the frame of American gods. They stress the perspective that is presented to us from the beginning of the book. And this suggests that the book here is addressing us outright. None of this can actually be happening. None of this is real. Think of it as a metaphor. Religions are places to stand and look and act, vantage points from which to view the world. They are themselves lenses. They are themselves a means of interpreting. And that, at least, is true. Back when we began our discussion of American gods, or if you've listened to a handful of other podcasts that I've done through the years, I talked about what it is that makes metaphor so important. That metaphor is a way of explaining the outside world, of parsing it, of fitting it to a pattern, of making it understandable, and crucially, of then being able to communicate that understanding to others. I can't communicate to you what the color red is in my head. I can't communicate to you what it means to me in the silence of my soul. But what I can do is try and put that feeling into a metaphor. I can try and imbue a metaphor with my sense of the color red and pass that metaphor onto you and hope that you can extract a meaning that is at least similar to the one that I intended. So yes, in a sense, Religions are metaphors, in as much as religions are places to stand and look and act, vantage points from which to view the world. They are a collection of metaphors, in effect. They are a means of understanding, of unlocking the truth of the world around us. And again, way back in the first episode of Storms on the Way, I talked about Gaiman's intent with American Gods to create an aggregate mythology, not a single myth, not even a handful of myths, but a comprehensive mythology that, in some extent, to some degree, in some way, explains America. What then is the purpose of religion within that frame, within that kind of meta-metaphor, if you like? If religions are places to stand and look and act, vantage points from which to view the world, what are we being told now? What is this odd digression in the narrative tone of American Gods doing? None of this can actually be happening. If it makes you comfortable, you can simply think of it as a metaphor. Religions are, by definition, metaphors. Okay, so you can think of this as a metaphor because the religious conflict that we're about to see, to the degree that we're about to see a religious conflict, and hey, I've got an internal question mark over that too. Religious conflicts are metaphors, so just think of it as a metaphor. Religions are places to stand and look and act, vantage points from which to view the world. Well, as previously established, religions are metaphors, so this must be true of metaphors too. So none of this is happening. Such things could not occur in this day and age. Never a word of it is literally true. Although it all happened. And the next thing that happened like this. This is, by the way, probably my favorite phrase that, or my favorite passage, my favorite sentence. Certainly, never a word of it is literally true. Although it all happened, and the next thing that happened like this. That is probably my favorite sentence that Gaiman writes in the entire book. I love that very, very much. So, religions are metaphors. Metaphors are not real. None of this is happening. Such things could not occur in this day and age. Never a word of it is literally true. We know that for a fact. None of this is happening. It's all metaphorical, although it all happened. Even as we are being told that this is impossible, that this is just a metaphor, the narrative is emphasizing the fact that metaphors actually are real, that they are true, that this is, in a sense, literally happening. The metaphor, the interpretational framework that is established around these things may not be literally true, but that doesn't stop it from being actually true, from being emotionally true or philosophically true, or hey, just metaphorically true. The truth value of a metaphor actually has nothing to do with the actual words that you use or the actual events which take place. The truth of a metaphor is a much more powerful thing, particularly in the frame of American Gods, because religion, whatever that means, may or may not be a metaphor, but the gods are certainly metaphors. Odin himself is a metaphor. We credit him with power and with abilities, with a history, with a personality, with relationships that are simply metaphors which allow us to understand the world. Okay. Tom says, I think the if it makes you comfortable is key here as well, as this is far too stupendous for us to comprehend, so it's easier to dismiss it as untruth for protection, maybe, like Lovecraftian. That's an interesting idea. Oh, he continued that thought, like Lovecraftian narrators going insane. Yes, the idea of Lovecraftian horror being that the truth of the universe is simply too great and grand and inhumane for us to apprehend it and retain any sense of sanity whatsoever. We are driven mad by a true understanding of the universe, so we shelter beneath our blankets. So we carve out tiny, tiny little worlds that we can inhabit because that is the scale that our mind can accommodate. Perhaps, if it makes you comfortable, I think you're right, might be suggesting that kind of thing. I'm still, I think, unsure as to the purpose of this passage, at least within the frame of this chapter. This passage does, to me, make a powerful argument for the epilogue of this story being the heart of this story, because we are going to transition between this week's reading and next week's reading. We're going to transition between two very different tones. We're going to, wow, we're really going to descend Lookout Mountain here. We're really going to come back down to earth with a bump, though we're not going to leave behind the realm of gods. We're not going to leave behind the seemingly impossible. Instead, we're simply going to integrate it again. Now we have, I was about to say that we have torn asunder. We have removed the mundane world from the magical world, from the realm of gods. But in a sense, I think that is true. But we have also merged the two. The two have crashed into each other like two cars at a crowded intersection. We now just have a tangle of metal and fire that is barreling forward with whatever momentum it has maintained. We're in a dangerous and imminently apocalyptic position here. So again, we're going to have to extract these two worlds from one another as we move into the epilogue reading next time. Yes, Princess Ostrich makes the excellent point. I think you go very mad if you wanted to take any mythology literally. That is fair. That is absolutely fair. Good. Good. All right. Yes. Oh, and Skipa here is pulling out. This wording is its own kind of con game, which is an interesting thought too. The reassurance that is offered here is exactly the kind of reassurance that one might either explicitly or implicitly offer someone who is the victim of a con. Let's say that and nothing more for now, and circle back around to that idea at the end of the chapter. Okay, we have to continue moving forward here. Let's segue away from the conflict, the very imminent conflict at Lookout Mountain, and move back to Shadow. Even nothing cannot last forever. He might have been nowhere for 10 minutes or for 10,000 years. It made no difference. Time was an idea for which he no longer had any need. He could no longer remember his real name. He felt empty and cleansed in that place that was not a place. He was without form and void. He was nothing. And into that nothing, a voice said, "Oh, okay, cousin, we got to talk." And something that might once have been Shadow said, "Whiskey Jack?" "Yeah," said Whiskey Jack in the darkness. "You're a hard man to hunt down when you're dead. You didn't go to any of the places I figured. I had to look all over before I thought of checking here. Say, you ever find your tribe?" Shadow remembered the man and the girl and the disco beneath the spinning mirror ball. "I guess I found my family, but I found my tribe." Here in nothingness, Shadow lingers. He was without form and void, just in case that happens to be a significant phrase to you. This is, of course, what he wanted. He wanted to pass beyond the realm of experience into simple nothingness. But even nothingness is a place. Even this absence, even this fundamental absence, not nothing, as we're told in the previous chapter, not emptiness, not void, but complete absence of thing. There is no noun here to which we can attach a descriptor. It is absence. It is a blank space on the page. Even into this, Whiskey Jack can find his way, can intrude. And following the death of Shadow, Whiskey Jack, by inference, checks all the usual places, whatever they may be. I would have loved a bulleted list there just to let us know some of those places. But here he finds Shadow wherever Shadow is, this something that might once have been Shadow. So Whiskey Jack takes Shadow from the nothingness, from the absence. Yes, this is Becca says, "You're a hard man to find when you're dead." I adore Whiskey Jack. And Nicole says, "Shadow took the option that frightens me most." Oh, and Jen calls out, "I was listening to the Never-Ending Story the other day. Even nothing cannot last forever." Good. Yes, I just did a Point North one-shot on the Never-Ending Story. That's good. Excellent. Excellent. All right. So let's move on to Whiskey Jack's cabin, to his home, and to his conversation with Shadow. We learn here, by the way, that Whiskey Jack himself has suffered. He has lost his nephew. Lost his nephew Henry Bluejay to a diabetic coma while driving, and of course, given Gaiman's satirical perspective here, given his satirical intent, there is, as Whiskey Jack explicitly suggests, something quintessentially American about a diabetic coma while driving. This is a confluence of things which are very, very American indeed. "I'm sorry about your nephew." "Me too. So now I'm living here in the North, long way from the white man's diseases, white man's roads, white man's road signs, white man's yellow Miatas, white man's caramel popcorn, white man's beer." Whiskey Jack looked at the can. "When you people finally give up and go home, you can leave us the Budweiser breweries," he said. "Where are we?" asked Shadow. "Am I on the tree? Am I Dead? Am I here? I thought everything was finished. What's real? Yes, said Whiskey Jack. Yes. What kind of answer is yes? It's a good answer. True answer, too. Shadow said, are you a god as well? Whiskey Jack shook his head. I'm a culture hero, he said. We do the same shit gods do. We just screw up more and nobody worships us. They tell stories about us, but they tell ones that make us look bad along with the ones where we come out fairly okay. I see, said Shadow, and he did see more or less. Look, said Whiskey Jack, this is not a good country for gods. My people figured that out early on. There are creator spirits who found the earth or made it or shit it out. But you think about it. Who's going to worship Coyote? He made love to Porcupine Woman and got his dick shot through with more needles than a pincushion. He'd argue with rocks and the rocks would win. So yeah, my people figured that maybe there's something at the back of it all, a creator, a great spirit. And so we say thank you to it because it's always good to say thank you, but we never built churches. We didn't need to. The land was the church. The land was the religion. The land was older and wiser than the people who walked on it. It gave us salmon and corn and buffalo and passenger pigeons. It gave us wild rice and walleye. It gave us melon and squash and turkey, and we were the children of the land, just like the porcupine and the skunk and the blue jay. It is easy to miss there. We were the children of the land, just like the porcupine and the skunk and the blue jay. Of course, a veiled reference there to his nephew, Henry Blue Jay. That's rather beautifully done. Yeah, good. Culture heroes don't have the same pressures as gods, says Skipa. Yeah. Well, we talked about this a little bit when we were discussing Shadow's first encounter with Whiskey Jack and with Johnny Appleseed, the difference between cultural heroes, folkloric heroes, as I mentioned at the time, and actual mythic heroes, actual mythic gods. The different kinds of stories that we tell and the ways in which culture is shaped by myth, and culture is kind of given structure almost by folklore. That is to say that myths are the stories that we tell which give a foundation to the world, give a structure to the world, explain the world. But folklore is kind of the story that we tell about ourselves telling stories. It is the story about America in progress in a way that myths of the old gods, which are anchored in antiquity, or myths about the new gods, which are anchored in presence and immediacy, those myths are different from folklore. But here, Whiskey Jack confirms everything that we discussed when we were discussing him and Johnny Appleseed too. There is a difference between the god and the folk hero. And that difference is, well, the application of worship, for one, but also a kind of sanitization of the myth. Now, I'm not sure that I accept Whiskey Jack's thesis statement here. We do the same shit gods do. We just screw up more and nobody worships us. They tell stories about us, but they tell the ones which make us look bad, along with the ones where we come out fairly okay. There are lots of stories about lots of gods in lots of various panthea, which present that god in a less than ideal light. I don't necessarily think that we want to talk positively about Zeus transforming himself into a swan so that he can seduce a lady. That doesn't necessarily make Zeus look fantastic. So I'm not sure that I completely buy the nature there. For me, the difference is, as I say, the difference between the foundation of the world and the foundation of us, our culture. In a sense, none of the gods, let me cancel the slide for goodness sake, because I keep forgetting to take these things down. The gods that we see in American Gods are not about America. We don't tell stories of Odin in America because Odin is in any way connected to America. We tell stories of Odin because we came here. We are the immigrants, and then thereafter, he was the immigrant. We don't tell stories of Bilquis in America because Bilquis relates to America. That's not how this whole thing works. Folk heroes are kind of the stories that we tell about America. We tell about the here and the now. And that's a very different kind of perspective. And this, too, ties back to the introduction, or the reintroduction at the beginning of this chapter, of the concept of a kind of monomythic faith. Because here, even Whiskey Jack is kind of acknowledging that and says, yeah, there's a creator, there's a spirit, there's a something. There's something came first before there was us. And we say thank you because it's nice to say thank you. There is a connection there with this idea of a monomythic god that stands behind the gods who were created by human worship. This does seem to be part of the kind of cosmological or metaphysical structure that Gaiman is referencing here, that there is an omnipotent presence, perhaps. I mean, the exact nature of the monotheistic God that Gaiman is gesturing toward is indistinct. We don't really get enough information to pin that down, but we do get the sense that even the gods are aware of their own kind of temporal nature. And we talked before when we were talking about creation myths. None of these gods created the world. None of these gods could have created the world because they all, by definition, came after the advent of humanity. These gods rise out of stories, and they have powers that are attributed to them by stories, but they didn't come first. They are not eldest. None of these gods is Tom Bombadil. I'll put it that way. A little throwaway there for the there and back again audience. Yes, good. Okay, let's keep going because it is already 3:15 here in Oklahoma City, and I still have a half dozen slides. Oh my gosh, maybe 8 slides. Okay, let's do it. We're going to get to Whiskey Jack and his perspective on the war. And hey, you guys, maybe it's time that Shadow gets it. It's going to be a bloodbath, said Whiskey Jack flatly. Shadow saw it then. He saw it all, stark in its simplicity. He shook his head, and he began to chuckle. And he shook his head some more, and the chuckle became a full-throated laugh. You okay? I'm fine, said Shadow. I just saw the hidden Indians. Not all of them, but I saw them anyhow. Probably Ho Chunk then. Those guys could never hide worth a damn. He looked up at the sun. Time to go back, he said. He stood up. It's a two-man con, said Shadow. It's not a war at all, is it? Whiskey Jack patted Shadow's arm. You're not so dumb, he said. They walked back to Whiskey Jack's shack. He opened the door. Shadow hesitated. I wish I could stay here with you, he said. This seems like a good place. There are a lot of good places, said Whiskey Jack. That's kind of the point. Listen, gods die when they're forgotten. People too. But the land's still here. The good places and the bad. The land isn't going anywhere, and neither am I. Shadow closed the door. Something was pulling at him. He was alone in the darkness once more, but the darkness became brighter and brighter until it was burning like the sun. And then the pain began. So we see here that, or we are about to see here, that Easter has arrived at the World Tree with Horus, that they are getting Shadow down, and that Easter is warming him, renewing him, bringing him back to life. After encouraging Horus, of course, to fly into the sky and remove the clouds from the sun. She wants the bright sunlight for the restoration of Shadow. This is essential. And we see that, I think, here from a different perspective. He was alone in the darkness once more, but the darkness became brighter and brighter until it was burning like the sun, and then the pain began. And if you are, as I am, a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you might be thinking of season 6 Buffy, where, minor spoilers, Buffy is returned to life and finds the world more painful than she can endure. It's a pretty terrible connection, actually, now that I think about it out loud. Yeah. Yeah, Sarah says here in the YouTube chat, I find that interesting. These gods are not creators. They are created by humans. Well, they are created by metaphors. Humans needed to understand how the world came into being. We are curious about beginnings. That is one of the things that define us. So we wanted to know how the world was created. So we told a story about how the world was created that seemed to match the necessary facts. Well, we know that there is a world, and we know that there is a sky, and we're aware that things generally have a continuity of existence that moves from beginning to ending. Here is a story that encapsulates that. And we're going to credit it to this figure who exists outside of the world, because obviously the world could only be created by a figure that exists outside of the world. That is our creation myth. And in that myth, through which we seek to explore and explain the world in which we live, we credit some being that we then create. And we credit that being with the power to create the world, because that is a necessary part of the component. But of course, that figure could not have come first, not within Gaiman's framework here. So all of that aside, this is the moment at which Shadow understands what is going on. It is a two-man con. It's not a war at all. You're not so dumb, says Whiskey Jack. And for those of you who missed the introduction of Whiskey Jack in our discussion here in Storms on the Way, or for those of you who have simply forgotten, it is worth noting that Whiskey Jack is effectively the Native American version of Loki. He has a pretty profound insight into trickster stories and into cons. So that's worth bearing in mind too. Good. Let's keep going then. This takes us to a subplot that has actually been unfolding for quite some time now. This is the newly resurrected Laura and Mr. World. I didn't pull any of the earlier scenes because they're pretty fragmentary and they're pretty short, and they serve basically to kind of get these characters where they are going. Mr. World dispatched Mr. Town to Yggdrasil, to the actual tree in the real world, apparently, not distinct from the tree in the realm of gods. The two seem to coexist, but he is sent there to go and get a stick for reasons which will become apparent later. He does so. He hates Shadow still. He mimes twisting the stick, and Shadow begins to bleed from his side, an echo, of course, of the spear that impales Odin's side when he is hanging from Yggdrasil in certain versions of that myth. Then Mr. World, trying to leave the farm where Yggdrasil is located, finds himself turned around again and again. He keeps finding himself back at the farm. And all of this is a means of demonstrating that the lines between the worlds are blurring. He spends 8 hours or -1 minutes climbing the branches of Yggdrasil, depending on whether you go by the watch that he is wearing or the clock in his car. As he tries to leave, space itself is warped around Yggdrasil, and he finds himself returning again and again. His sat-nav is foiled by the twisting of the world, the twisting of space and time, now that these worlds are crashing into each other. Then he meets Laura. He picks up the hitchhiker, and Laura is just fantastic throughout the entire sequence because she knows apparently exactly what is going on, and Mr. Town is as narcissistic and foul as ever. Let's get into this slide. He was glad he hadn't used the Big Mac line. This woman wasn't a barroom one-nighter. Mr. Town knew that in his soul. It might have taken him 50 years to find her, but this was finally it. This was the one, this wild, magical woman with the long, dark hair. This was love. Look, he said as they approached Chattanooga. The wipers sloshed the rain across the windshield, blurring the gray of the city. How about I find a motel for you tonight? I'll pay for it, and once I make my delivery, we can take a hot bath together for a start. Warm you up. That sounds wonderful, said Laura. What are you delivering? That stick, he told her and chuckled, had one on the back seat. Okay, she said, humoring him. Then don't tell me, Mr. Mysterious. He told her it would be best if she waited in the car in the Rock City parking lot while he made his delivery. He drove up the side of Lookout Mountain in the gusting rain, never breaking 30 miles per hour with his headlights burning. They parked at the back of the parking lot. He turned off the engine. Hey, Mac, before you get out of the car, don't I get a hug? Asked Laura with a smile. You surely do, said Mr. Town, and he put his arms around her, and she snuggled close to him while the rain pattered a tattoo on the roof of the Ford Explorer. He could smell her hair. There was a faintly unpleasant scent beneath the perfume. Travel would do it every time. That bath, he decided, was a real must for both of them. He wondered if there was any place in Chattanooga where he could get one of those scented bath bombs his first wife had loved so much. Laura rested her head against his, and her hands stroked the line of his neck absently. Mac, I keep thinking, you must really want to know what happened to those friends of yours, she asked, Woody and Stone. Do you? Yeah, he said, moving his lips down to hers for their first kiss. Sure I do. So she showed him. So she showed him. The ignominious end of Mr. Town here. Laura's involvement in this plot is perhaps a little self-indulgent. Perhaps it feels as though Gaiman is just having fun in this regard. But yes, we are here. Nicole puts it perfectly. 100% have met this type of guy, at every bar. He is so skeezy. Yes, he absolutely is. Aaron says, Mr. Town is such a realistic brand of creepazoid. Yes. Tom asks, I wonder if Alistair ever looks at the YouTube chat and just thinks, the F are they talking about? I'll just move on. Yeah, sometimes if you guys are just in the midst of a conversation and there's no way that I can find my way back to the spring that has flowed into this tempestuous river, yeah, sometimes I will just segue away from it and move on to the next slide. But, generally speaking, you guys are very well behaved. Becca asks, why isn't Elizabeth here? I wanted to hear about bath time and bath bombs. She will hear about this. She hasn't been keeping up with the reading, I should say. So we'll talk about this definitely. Yeah, when Laura and bath bombs are mentioned in the same passage, that's going to be her favorite part of the book. I guarantee it. And Aaron says, I like that Laura ended that circle of douchebaggery. Yeah, Mr. Town is the worst. And he's the worst, explicitly, clearly, even in this passage. Let's look at the beginning here. He was glad that he hadn't used the Big Mac line. This woman wasn't a barroom one-nighter. Mr. Town knew that in his soul. It might have taken him 50 years to find her, but this was finally it. This was the one, this wild, magical woman with the long, dark hair. This was love. This was love, he said, even as he is objectifying her, even as he is pretty effectively dehumanizing her. He doesn't know her. He has barely met her. But still in his soul, this woman wasn't a barroom one-nighter. That is a fairly gross, descriptor to attach to any human being, I think, a barroom one-nighter. But Mr. Town knew this in his soul. This entire relationship is about him. It is not about her. It is not about them. He has no perspective here. He has no honesty within his soul at this point. This woman wasn't a barroom one-nighter. Mr. Town knew that in his soul. It might have taken him 50 years to find her, but this was finally it. This was the one, this wild, magical woman with the long, dark hair. It is fair to say, I think, that in the year 2000, the year 2001, the whole manic pixie dream girl trope wasn't quite what it is today, but Neil Gaiman will be very glad to know that we have taken exactly the thing that he is describing here, exactly the awful, nerdy phenomenon that he is describing here, and we have given it a name and a TV tropes page. He is romanticizing Laura. He is effectively othering Laura. He is dehumanizing Laura and turning her into this avatar of exoticism. He wants this relationship. He wants this experience. And still, even while he's doing so, even while he's doing this, well, we can take a hot bath together for a start and warm you up. And if you're not imagining the wink and the finger guns as he says that, then you are a better person than I, because let me tell you, he's winking it up and finger gunning it up right there in my imagination, at least. Then when we get to the parking lot, he could smell her hair. There was a fairly unpleasant scent beneath the perfume. Travel would do it every time. That bath, he decided, was a real must for both of them. This is just predatory and gross and dehumanizing. Now Laura is here, returned to a semblance of life, or at least given a measure of her life back. He is still incapable of seeing her as a human being. She is only ever an object in his, orbit here. So she showed them. So she showed him, I should say. Laura, once again, demonstrating her absolute capability and proving, too, that being returned to life has not robbed her of her clarity, of her focus. She knows, at least in part, what is happening, and she takes action. Yeah. Yeah, we have deified Zoe Deschanel, haven't we? Says Aaron. Look, it's it's not Zoe Deschanel's fault that we've done that. I would want to, pull back from that. Oh, Nicole says, too bad they wasted Dane Cook on Robbie already. No, you're right. That would be perfect. He's just like TV Robbie, says Skipa. Good. And this, says Nicole, is a very show Laura scene. This I find so interesting. The depiction of Laura that we get on screen, the depiction of the Laura that we sorry, Jennifer has just says, let's give you a bath. Pew pew, wink, gross. I agree, Jennifer. I think you're right. This is a great perspective on show Laura. I think you're absolutely right. Show Laura takes so long to show up in the book. Whereas in the show, we've kind of taken these elements of her character and pulled them back in the narrative. Though ultimately, of course, show Laura could end up in a very different place than book Laura. Speaking of where Laura will end up, we still have a number of slides to get to. Laura then takes the stick and goes to visit Mr. World. I shall assume that Mr. Town is dead, he said. Welcome, spear carrier. Thank you. I'm sorry about Mac, she said. Were you friends? Not at all. He should have kept himself alive if he wanted to keep his job, but you brought his stick. He looked her up and down with eyes that glimmered like the orange embers of a dying fire. I'm afraid you have the advantage of me. They call me Mr. World here at the top of the hill. I'm Shadow's wife. Of course, the lovely Laura, he said. I should have recognized you. He had several photographs of you up above his bed in the cell that we once shared, and if you don't mind my saying so, You look lovelier than you have any right to look. Shouldn't you be further along in the whole road to rot and ruin business by now? I was, she said simply. I was much further along. I'm not sure what changed. I know when I started feeling better, it was this morning. These women in the farm, they gave me water from their well. An eyebrow raised. Erd's well? Surely not. She pointed to herself. Her skin was pale and her eye sockets were dark, but she was manifestly whole. She was indeed a walking corpse. She was freshly dead. It won't last, said Mr. World. The Norns give you a little taste of the past. It will dissolve into the present soon enough, and then those pretty blue eyes will roll out of their sockets and ooze down those pretty cheeks, which will, by then, of course, no longer be so pretty. By the way, you have my stick. Can I have it, please? He pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes, took a cigarette, lit it with a disposable black bic. She said, Can I have one of those? Sure. I'll give you a cigarette if you give me my stick. The incidental detail, of course, it's Lucky Strikes. Of course, it's a disposable black bic. This is the disposability of American culture here. Yeah. Throughout the book, says Aaron, Mr. Town served a real great purpose on commenting on how ordinary people voluntarily assume those archetypes for good or ill. I like that very much. Yes, he is the, I suppose, just following orders guy. It's earlier in this chapter when we get the perspective on, how things were at the agency, and then the world went weird. The world went absurd, and he stayed in. He didn't have to, but he did. And that is, you're right, I think, Aaron, the complicity of mortals here. Nicole says, I find it interesting that people keep objectifying her, since as a corpse that should have no soul, isn't she technically an object? Well, I might argue that the only thing that was keeping Laura moving was her animus. It was her soul. It may be that the only thing of Laura that is still real is her soul. And I have no trouble believing that Mr. Town objectifying her and Mr. World objectifying her are supposed to be reflections of one another. That Mr. Town is objectifying a woman as a man objectifies a woman, as that kind of man objectifies a woman, whereas Mr. World is objectifying her in the way that a god objectifies a mortal. She is a vessel. She is incidental. This is, a game about numbers. This is a bulk business being worshipped. The faith game is a bulk business. And any individual human, not terribly important, except, of course, Shadow, for reasons which are now apparent. Yeah. Good. Oh, Sarah says, I'd say it would probably make her skin crawl if it weren't already. Sorry, that was pretty gross. I appreciate that you regretted that, Sarah. I appreciate that you regretted that one before it was even complete. Yeah. Like she literally smells dead, says Jennifer. Book dudes, cut it out. That's fair. Grosser because she's dead. Yeah. And Becca asks, Laura seems to get male gazed a lot. Anyone notice that? I think all of the female characters, to some extent, get male gazed in this book. I think this is part of Gaiman's critique on American popular culture. I think this is part of what he is saying about the nature of America and Americanism in the latter years of the 20th century, early years of the 21st century. I think that's a very fair and actually fairly trenchant and progressive observation for that time and place. Laura gets male gazed, if we can verb form that, more so than other characters, I think, simply because she's more present than other characters. There's certainly the implication, whenever we talk about female characters, we kind of connect them to sex and sexuality in a somewhat objectifying manner. There are a few exceptions to that, but it does happen. And then we get the counterpoint, of course, which is the character like Bilquis or the character like Bast, who take control of their sexuality not because they are women, but because they are gods, and therefore exist somewhat outside of the frame, though even the end of Bilquis's story kind of gives us another perspective on that. Yeah. Good. Okay. Let's keep going because we're almost there. Sure, I'll give you a cigarette if you give me my stick. She leaned back just a little until she was touching his chest with her back. His left arm curved around her. It was an intimate gesture. His left hand was open in front of her. She closed both of her hands around the top of the stick, exhaled, concentrated. Please, my stick, he said in her ears. Yes, she said, it's yours. And then, not knowing if it would mean anything, she said, I dedicate this death to Shadow. and she stabbed the stick into her chest, just below the breastbone, felt it writhe and change in her hands as the stick became a spear. The boundary between sensation and pain had diffused since she had died. She felt the spearhead penetrate her chest, felt it push out through her back. A moment's resistance, she pushed harder, and the spear thrust into Mr. World. She could feel the warm breath of him on the cool skin of her neck as he wailed in hurt and surprise, impaled on the spear. She did not recognize the words he spoke, nor the language he said them in. She pushed the shaft of the spear further in, forcing it through her body into and through his. She could feel his hot blood spurting onto her back. "Bitch," he said in English. "You fucking bitch." There was a wet, gurgling quality to his voice. She guessed that the blade of the spear must have sliced a lung. Mr. World was moving now, or trying to move, and every move he made rocked her too. They were joined by the pole, impaled together like two fish on a single spear. He now had a knife in one hand, she saw, and he stabbed her chest and breasts randomly and wildly with the knife, unable to see what he was doing. She did not care. What a knife cuts to a corpse. I mean, we should acknowledge, given the discussion that we just had, the sexual implications of this. Here they are curled together, this intimate half embrace. His left arm curved around her, an intimate gesture, his left hand open in front of her. Then we get the breath on the back of her neck. They are very close together here. And she impales herself, penetrates herself, and in turn penetrates him. The sacrifice here is impossible to kind of disentangle from the act of what would we call that, deicide. Here she kills a god, strives deliberately to kill a god, and does so with the power of story, does so in the name of shadow, and does so with the sacrifice of her own blood. And we know that Laura does bleed now. We saw that back in the Norns' farmhouse when she drank the water. That will pass, but right now she can feel, she can have sensation as she's experiencing this. Was the stick mistletoe, says Aaron? No, this was the stick that was taken from Yggdrasil. This is the stick that was taken from, this was not intended necessarily to kill Shadow. This was a separate story, yeah. Yes, Tom says, may I just mention the fact that penetration is going over rather unexpectedly, considering all the sexual overtones projected Laura's way? Yes, exactly. This is it. As he's moving and they're rocking together with this penetration joining them, this is clearly a sexual act, but is not creative in the way that sexual acts usually are, or at least potentially are, but is destructive. This is the other side of that sex and death divide. These two ideas so often conjoined in human experience. A moment's resistance, she pushed harder, and the spear thrust into Mr. World. She could feel the warm breath of him on the cool skin of her neck, and he wailed in hurt and surprise, impaled on the spear. Then we have him swearing at her. Mr. World was moving now, or trying to move, and every move he made rocked her too. They were joined by the pole, impaled together like two fish on a single spear. He now had a knife in one hand, she saw, and he stabbed her chest and breasts randomly and wildly with the knife, unable to see what he was doing. Even that separation, that clarification there, he stabbed her chest and breasts. I mean, if you're being stabbed, those two words, at least one of them is unnecessary, right? And it's probably the latter of the two, but it's not unnecessary here in this context because of the sexual overtone, because this is a kind of violent sex. This is, or at least a kind of sexual violence. Either one of those, I think, is applicable here. Yeah. Wouldn't he have bled Icor? It's a quibbling point, I know, but I feel like one Gaiman would have considered. We don't know for sure. We don't. The stories told aren't necessarily clear. There certainly are stories of the Norse gods where it would have been blood, where they were, effectively constructed in the same way that men were. Again, capital M. They're not in the same way that humans are. So it could have been. Certainly, it would have been possible. Yeah, either of those interpretations, I think, would have worked. Yeah, but certainly for Laura, it would have been much more intimate and immediate for it to be blood. Good. Good. And of course, yes, we're kind of commending the sacrifice here. That's excellent. All right, so let's keep moving. You guys, we've got so much to cover still. This is terrible. All right. I say terrible. I mean, I'm having the time of my life here, but still. So Shadow comes back, gets to Rock City, and finds Loki. I figured it out, said Shadow. Kind of. I'm not sure when I figured it out. Maybe it was when I was hanging on the tree, maybe before. It was from something Wednesday said to me at Christmas. Loki just stared at him, saying nothing. It's just a two-man con, said Shadow, like the bishop and the diamond necklace and the cop, like the guy with the fiddle and the guy who wants to buy the fiddle and the poor sap in between them who pays for the fiddle. Two men who appear to be on opposite sides playing the same game. Loki whispered, "You're ridiculous." Why? I liked what you did at the motel. That was smart. You needed to be there to make sure that everything went according to plan. I saw you. I even realized who you were. And I still never twigged that you were their Mr. World. Or maybe I did, somewhere down deep. I knew your voice anyway. Shadow raised his voice. "You can come out," he said to the cavern. "Wherever you are, show yourself." The wind howled in the opening of the cavern, and it drove a spray of rainwater in toward them. Shadow shivered. "I'm tired of being played for a sucker," said Shadow. "Show yourself. Let me see you." There was a change in the shadows at the back of the cave. Something became more solid. Something shifted. "You know too damn much, my boy," said Wednesday's familiar rumble. So here it is, exposed. Shadow has now drawn the connection between Loki and Mr. World. We get this anyway. A careful reading will reveal this unambiguously by the time we hit this point, because back when Mr. World is talking to Laura, he mentions sharing a cell with Shadow. And of course, Mr. World didn't share a cell with Shadow. Loki Lysmith shared a cell with Shadow. So we've already had everything but a confirmation, but this is the moment when it becomes explicit. And this is the moment when we draw back Wednesday into the narrative. And you guys, it is difficult to read this, having been somewhat convinced by Wednesday ourselves. I think Gaiman makes the reader complicit in Wednesday's plot. We are supposed to see him as the good guy. We are supposed to see the old gods as the good guys. We're leaning very heavily on this idea throughout the span of the novel. But here at this point, it cracks. And Wednesday's, well, awfulness, his selfishness, his vile con is revealed. In fact, it's revealed specifically. He thought he could see Wednesday now, standing in the shadows. Behind him, through him, were the bars of a cage which held what looked like plastic leprechauns. He was a shape made of darkness, who became more real the more Shadow looked away from him, allowed him to take shape in his peripheral vision. "I feed on death that's dedicated to me," said Wednesday. "Like my death on the tree?" said Shadow. "That," said Wednesday, "was special." "And do you also feed on death?" asked Shadow, looking at Loki. Loki shook his head wearily. "No, of course not," said Shadow. "You feed on chaos." Loki smiled at that, a brief, pained smile, and orange flames danced in his eyes and flickered like burning lace beneath his pale skin. "We couldn't have done it without you," said Wednesday from the corner of Shadow's eye. "I'd been with so many women." "You needed a son," said Shadow. Wednesday's ghost voice echoed, "I needed you, my boy." "Yes, my own boy. I knew that you'd been conceived, but your mother left the country. It took us so long to find you. And when we did find you, you were in prison. We needed to find out what made you tick, what buttons we could press to make you move, who you were." Loki looked momentarily pleased with himself. Shadow wanted to hit him. "And you had a wife to go back home to. It was unfortunate, not insurmountable." So here we get the absolute clarification here. Sarah's saying somewhere down deep sounds weird to me. Maybe because the collocation is deep down. Yes. Is it a Britishism? She asks. No, not a standard Britishism. Anyway, it is an example of a poetic technique where you can invert the usual word order to force the reader to reappraise them. I would argue that it is simply supposed to sound strange and supposed to sound a little inelegant and a little unorthodox, but it forces you to reconsider the words as you come across them. Skip asks, "Do you think Shadow's mom left the country because she knew something?" It's an interesting question. We just unfortunately don't get enough information to come to any kind of firm conclusion. We're certainly free to speculate about that. It seems unlikely. It seems unlikely that she would know something, particularly given that she goes to Norway. There may actually be a element of Shadow's birth, of the narrative or the myth that compelled her to take that action. This may be Wednesday's, mythic power kind of working against him here and forcing her from the country. But yeah, that's interesting. Good. "My dad wanted to go on a road trip, so he killed my wife." Yeah, says that comes from Nicole in the YouTube chat. Yeah, not great, it turns out. He is mercenary. Yeah. And Becca says, that's the plot summary right there. You're right. That should be the one line, Netflix description of American Gods when it finally makes its way to Netflix. So the con is now revealed. Odin and Loki throughout have been working together. The whole conflict between the old gods and the new is a con. It is a grift. It has been staged so that these deaths, this titanic, tumultuous, apocalyptic war, the God War, can be done in Odin's name. And all of these deaths in Odin's name will empower him somehow, will restore him somehow. It's disheartening. It's despicable. And we can, I guess, use this to answer an earlier question, because we were unsure about the ways in which worship and faith could flow from one god to another. And still, I'm not sure that gods can believe in each other. I'm not sure that gods can worship each other, because here we're externalizing the act of worship, right? An act of worship can be, depending on the god that you believe in, a very quiet and internal thing. It can be an act of gratitude. It can be an act of contemplation or an act of meditation. It can be a ritualistic performance of some kind. But it can also be the dedication of a death. And the dedication of the death, particularly the deaths of gods, and of course, lest we forget, the deaths of mortal vessels who are carrying some gods. There are some, for want of a better term, possessed people on the battlefield here, and presumably a great deal of collateral damage around the periphery, that these deaths pledged to Odin are going to be climactic, that they are going to be disastrous. So Shadow goes to the gods and confronts them. This is after Loki has died and Odin has not yet retaken his physical form. Said Shadow to the air in a conversational voice, this is not a war. This was never intended to be a war. And if any of you think this is a war, you're deluding yourselves. He heard grumbling noises from both sides. He had impressed nobody. We're fighting for our survival, lowed a minotaur from one side of the arena. We're fighting for our existence, shouted a mouth in a pillar of glittering smoke from the other. This is a bad land for gods, said Shadow. As an opening statement, it wasn't friends, Romans, countrymen, but it would do. You've probably all learned that in your own way. The old gods are ignored. The new gods are quickly taken up, and as they are abandoned, cast aside for the next big thing. Either you've been forgotten, or you're scared you're going to be rendered obsolete, or maybe you're just getting tired of existing on the whim of people. The grumbles were fewer now. He had said something they agreed with. Now, while they were listening, he had to tell them the story. There was a god who came here from a far land and whose power and influence waned as belief in him faded. He was a god who took his power from sacrifice and from death, and especially from war. He would have deaths of those who fell in war dedicated to him, whole battlefields which in the old country gave him power and sustenance. Now he was old. He made his living as a grifter, working with another god from his pantheon, a god of chaos and deceit. Together they rooked the gullible. Together they took people for all they'd got. Somewhere in there, maybe 50 years ago, maybe 100, they put a plan into motion, a plan to create a reserve of power that they could both tap into, something that would make them stronger than they'd ever been. After all, what could be more powerful than a battlefield covered with dead gods? The game they played was called Let's You and Him Fight. Do you see? The battle you're here to fight isn't something that any of you can win or lose. The winning and the losing are unimportant to him, to them. What matters is that enough of you die. Each of you that falls in battle gives him power. Each of you that dies feeds him. Do you understand? Becca asks, is it bad that I want the Glittermouth to actually be the god of glitter? As Skipa asks, a mouth and a pillar of glittering smoke, is that disco? It could be, though, a god of disco. I would expect more velour and chest hair, I suppose. But certainly, I kind of like Becca's idea. This is just the god of glitter. He was, or she, genderless god of glitter, was very popular in, the 2000s. Good. Yes. Yes, good. Oh, not to be punny, says Nicole, but the revealed grift is very Godfather. Isn't it, though? Isn't it? There's a direct reference to that in the TV show, which I like quite a lot. A little reference there for book fans who've already read the story. So this entire plot is revealed, and thus the gods start to leave. Nancy comes to Shadow. We're going to talk, I think we're well past time here, so I'm going to move very quickly through the very end of this chapter. And then we're going to talk about the actual climax of the story next week when we're talking about the epilogue, because I think we can only understand the battle, the battlefield, the war, the conflict through the lens of our final resolution, our final resting place here. So we'll circle back around to this next week. But first we have to get to Laura. She said nothing. She simply waited. Shadow said, okay. Then he took his hand from hers and put it to her neck. She said, that's my husband. She said it proudly. I love you, babes, said Shadow. Love you, puppy, she whispered. He closed his hand around the golden coin that hung around her neck. He tugged hard at the chain, which snapped easily. Then he took the gold coin between his finger and thumb and blew on it, and opened his hand wide. The coin was gone. Her eyes were still open, but they did not move. He bent down then and kissed her gently on her cold cheek, but she did not respond. He did not expect her to. Then he got up and walked out of the cavern to stare into the night. The storms had cleared. The air felt fresh and clean and new once more. Tomorrow, he had no doubt, would be one hell of a beautiful day. I mentioned right back at the beginning of this session that there were two possible interpretations of the name Balder, that the simple etymology of Balder suggested that the name meant bold and brave. The more complex interpretation of the name Balder rests upon a meaning that is associated with light, shining one, or white one, specifically a shining god or white god. And when we combine that root with the other roots of Balder's name, one of the possible interpretations for his name is bright day or shining day. Here we end the climax with Balder, with shining day, looking out at the promise of a new shining day. The magic trick that removes the coin from Laura, that seems to simply remove the coin entirely, is of course entirely appropriate. Shadow has still no mastery of the story, no mastery of the trickster's craft, but his intention here is not to trick. He has discovered the root power of the performance itself, of the practice itself. We've talked all the way through the book about the practice of the vanish, the actual, physical manipulation of the coin, and then the story that makes the trick work. He has no story, but now he can really make the coin vanish. And that's enough. The removal of this burdensome semi-life from Laura, this quasi-life from Laura, is the greatest gift that he can give her. It's the only way that her story can end. So he vanishes the coin truly, and along with it, the life that sustained her. It's really rather beautiful, really rather powerful, and marks a moment at which the world itself begins to move toward a restoration of justice. The gods are now departing from Lookout Mountain. The gods are now departing from Rock City. Some have fallen. There is blood on the ground, blood on the hands of Odin and Loki, but Shadow prevented the war from going any further, and that is vital. So now the gods are disbanding and the world is returning to normal. And we're going to see, as we move into the epilogue, exactly what that means for the future. Yeah. Good. Let's actually wrap it up there. That's going to do it. We are, 25 minutes over time. Let's take a look at the last slide here. The next session, Tuesday, August the 1st, 2017 at 9 p.m. Eastern, chapters 19 and 20. We're going to finish up the book. Basically, we're going to move through the entire epilogue of the book. That's going to make for a very interesting conversation. And if we have time at the end, we may take a little Q&A. We may take a few discussion topic questions right there at the end. So that is next Tuesday at 9 p.m. Eastern. That is going to wrap up the book. However, that is not the last session of Storms on the Way. The following Sunday, we're going to have a session dedicated to the two short stories that followed after American Gods, Monarch of the Glen, and Black Dog, both of which can be found online. So I urge you to read those short stories. I urge you to hang out for that live session, and we will talk about the end of the book next week. Guys, thank you all so much. I know, right? Aaron says, thanks for the seminar. I'm amazed you made it through all the slides. Well, it took me an extra 25 minutes, half an hour, but We did it. And also, you guys didn't see my face hardly at all. So let me cancel the slide and I'll just talk directly to you here at the end of the session. Thank you so much for being with me here today. Thank you so much for sticking with me through American Gods. I know there's going to be some discussion over on the Point North Patreon Discord for American Gods. There has been a spoiler discussion running there for a little while. Now that we're there, if you are interested in discussing your theories about what it means to be worshipped, what it means to dedicate the deaths of a god to the name of another god, what does it mean when Laura dedicates the death of Mr. World and presumably the death of herself to Shadow? Does that empower Shadow? Does that have any meaning? Is Shadow meaningfully to Laura here a god? We can start to unpick all of those questions both next week as we discuss the epilogue and over on the Patreon exclusive Point North Discord channel. If you would like more from Point North, if you would like to help me to continue to produce these sessions and to talk about more books and more movies and maybe even your favorite book and movie, head on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia and pledge your support. Every single dollar is helpful. Every single dollar counts when we're trying to produce this kind of content in this kind of form with this kind of tone, honestly. This is all possible because of your generous support. So thank you to everyone who does support over on Patreon, and thank you to everyone who is planning on supporting over on Patreon. And I should say too that your support over on Patreon gets you access to the weekly Patreon exclusive live Q&A. If you just want to hang out with me for an hour on a Friday afternoon, every Friday afternoon, or sometimes evening and sometimes morning, you just hang out with me once a week and we talk about whatever crosses our minds. And if you have questions on any subject, then you can ask them there. So head on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia. Pledge your support today. All of this is possible because of you. So thank you. I'll be back next week with more. Until then, you guys, thanks for sticking with me. Thanks for listening and take care.